For years, the world viewed Gaza as a victim, but few imagined that one day its own people would turn against those who claimed to protect them. Hamas, once a symbol of resistance, now faces the fury of a population tired of living amidst ruins and broken promises. It's a painful paradox. Those who promised liberation have become the new jailers, and when the oppressor comes from within, the cry for freedom echoes even louder. These protests were not born of foreign ideologies or political manipulation. They were born of empty stomachs, of nights without light, of mothers who can no longer feed their children. It is the revolt of the forgotten, of those who have always been reduced to numbers in international reports. For the first time, the people of Gaza are not asking the world for help. They are asking the world to listen to them, because there is a huge difference between asking for help and demanding dignity. But the big question is, what happens when a people loses their fear? When courage becomes contagious and silence is no longer enough? What's emerging in Gaza could be more than a protest. It could be the first chapter in a transformation no one saw coming. And perhaps the beginning of a new kind of resistance, not against external enemies, but against the very system that holds them captive. Gaza protests against Hamas, an internal revolt in the region. Few imagine that, in the heart of Gaza, it's not just external bombardments that shake the ground, but the very voice of the people, tired of living amidst ruins and fear. The streets that once echoed with cries of resistance against external enemies have now become the stage for a new battle. The people against their own government. Hamas, which was born as a symbol of defense and hope, now finds itself challenged by citizens demanding the basics: light, bread, and freedom. It's curious how, when pain surpasses its limit, even silence decides to cry out. These protests, though small compared to the great global revolutions, carry the same symbolic weight as the Prague demonstrations of 1968 or the Iranian women's movement of 2022, a collective cry against oppression. Young people in Gaza, with simple cell phones and enormous courage, record everything and send their messages of desperation and resistance to the world. These videos are hastily recorded, posted before the police can reach them. There is something deeply human in this act, the desire to say, "We are still alive," even when the world seems to have forgotten. But what's truly frightening isn't the noise of the crowds, but the fear that silence provokes after repression arrives. Hamas, accustomed to controlling through force, responds with arrests, censorship, and surveillance. But something's different this time. The indignation no longer stems from political parties, but from ordinary people: sellers, mothers, teachers. When everyday life rebels, power trembles. And perhaps this tremor is the harbinger of something greater, a silent movement still germinating in the shadows of Gaza. Life under Hamas. Control, fear, and everyday survival. Living in Gaza is waking up every day with the feeling that time has stopped, not for lack of will, but for lack of freedom. The narrow streets, covered in dust and hope, are watched by invisible eyes. Any wrong word can become a sentence. Hamas controls not only the borders, but also what you think, what you say, and sometimes even what you dream. It's like living inside a book where the ending has already been written, and no one dares change the plot. Scarcity is a cruel but effective teacher. It teaches us to conserve the barely there light, to share the never enough bread, and to smile even when our hearts bleed. Families create codes to communicate without being denounced, and young people grow up learning to remain silent more than to speak. A simple comment on social media can be interpreted as betrayal. There's a kind of fear that lodges itself in our bones, one that doesn't need soldiers on street corners, because it already lives within us. But it's curious how human beings find beauty even in pain. Amidst all this, there are those who play guitar at night. those who paint hidden murals, those who write poetry on napkins. These are small but powerful gestures. They are ways of saying, I'm still free in here, even if my body is trapped. And perhaps it is precisely this spark of humanity, this impulse to create, to resist, to dream, that sets the stage for what is to come. The moment when Gaza's silence finally transforms into voice. The trigger. What really brought people to the streets? Every revolt is born of an accumulation. It's not the first blow that breaks the vessel, but the last. In Gaza, this last blow came disguised as darkness. Days without electricity, refrigerators turned off, medicines expiring in the heat, children waking in the middle of the night, hungry. The people looked up and realized that the enemy wasn't just on the other side of the wall. He lived within his own territory, wearing the mantle of one who promised liberation, but learned to dominate. Disappointment is the most flammable fuel there is. The youth were the first to rise up, young people without jobs, without freedom, and without a future. Those who grew up under lockdowns and sirens decided they didn't want to live in fear for another generation. They organized themselves into secret groups, used VPNs, created hashtags, and uploaded videos. Each post was an act of courage, each word a symbolic bombshell against the silence. They didn't ask for luxury, just dignity. They wanted to work, study, and breathe without asking permission. But when the people discovered the power of their own voice, it's impossible to return everything to the way it was. The squares began to fill. Women left their homes with handmade signs, and even the weary elderly joined in. The revolt ceased to be political and became existential. It was no longer just about Hamas, but about the right to be human. And when a society reaches this point, no armed force can silence it for long. What would come next, however, would show the high price of challenging power in Gaza. The power's response: repression, arrests, and censorship. When power is threatened, it doesn't engage in dialogue, it reacts. And Hamas reacted as authoritarian regimes often do, with a clenched fist. Security forces took to the streets, interrupted broadcasts, confiscated cell phones, and fear once again spread freely in Gaza. The repression wasn't limited to protests. It penetrated homes, schools, and conversations. Anyone who dared to question disappeared, and silence once again became the city's official language. Journalists were persecuted, activists were arrested, and many had their families coerced. Social media, once a refuge for resistance, became traps. Profiles were tracked, messages intercepted, and hashtags became criminal evidence. Censorship was disguised as national security, as if silencing the people was synonymous with protecting order. It's always like this. Authoritarian governments call fear discipline, oppression stability, and obedience peace. But the people have learned to decipher this vocabulary. And even under this suffocating pressure, something new began to blossom. A quiet, almost invisible courage. Ordinary people began protecting one another, guarding evidence, and transmitting information anonymously. It was the beginning of an underground resistance, built on solidarity and cunning. Because when a government controls physical space, the people learn to occupy the invisible. And this invisible, like an ember beneath the ashes, was about to reignite and capture the attention of the entire world. The world watches. Political and diplomatic repercussions. No flame lit in Gaza goes unnoticed by the world. While the streets boiled with protests, in the cold rooms of Washington, Tel Aviv, and Brussels, analysts watched with calculating eyes. Every Hamas gesture, every leaked video, every muffled cry became a piece in a geopolitical chess game. Israel saw the uprising as an opportunity to weaken the enemy without firing a missile. The West, torn between ethics and interests, limited itself to cautious speeches and diplomatic reports. International organizations expressed deep concern. a fancy phrase that, in practice, means inaction. Few leaders dared openly criticize Hamas, fearing further inflaming a region already on fire. Some Arab countries, on the other hand, saw the demonstrations as a spark that could spread, and that frightened them. No one wants to see the mirror of their own people reflected in a crowd screaming for freedom. Fear of political contamination speaks louder than solidarity. But behind the scenes, some see this turmoil as a silent reconfiguration. Gaza, for decades treated as a theater of war, is now beginning to be seen as a stage for change. The people, once reduced to numbers and statistics, are becoming protagonists of their own narrative. And as leaders try to calculate the consequences, a new kind of power, that of global opinion, is gaining momentum. What remains to be seen is, will this global attention be enough to sustain the flame that still burns amidst the rubble? The flame of hope. What can be born from this internal revolt? Every pain has a hidden purpose, and perhaps the pain in Gaza is the beginning of something new. When a people who have learned to survive begin to dream again, the impossible becomes possible. The protests, even stifled, left seeds planted in every heart that dared to raise its voice. They are seeds of awareness, courage, and unity. Because true revolution doesn't begin in the streets, but within the people. And once awakened, they never go back to sleep. Young people who once only wanted to escape now talk about rebuilding. Mothers who wept in silence now teach their children to question. Small communities gather to discuss politics, the economy, the future, something unthinkable just a few years ago. It's a subtle, almost invisible movement, but with transformative potential. Profound change always begins this way, with small gestures, discreet words, and a stubborn faith that tomorrow can be different. And perhaps the greatest symbol of this hope lies precisely in what Hamas fears most: information. As long as there is internet, cameras, and voices willing to tell what's really happening, the truth will continue to slip through the bars. History shows that regimes fall, walls crumble, and oppressors disappear, but the will to be free survives it all. And it is this will, pulsing silently, that can rewrite the fate of Gaza and, who knows, inspire the entire world. Ultimately, what's happening in Gaza is more than an uprising. It's a reminder that every system based on fear has an expiration date. Oppression may be silenced for a time, but never forever. And perhaps the greatest lesson this story teaches us is this: when consciousness awakens, no wall, no government, no censorship can stop it. Power changes hands when the people decide they no longer accept being spectators of their own pain. Now, stop and think. How many times in your own life have you remained silent out of fear? How many times have you let others control your voice, your choices, or your dreams? Freedom begins within, and every time someone decides to stand up, whether in Gaza or anywhere else, a new spark is ignited. In the world, the awakening of a people is also an invitation for each of us to awaken. So if this story made you reflect, share this knowledge. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for future videos. Because what's happening in Gaza is just the beginning. There's much more behind these uprisings than the news shows. And understanding this can change the way you view power, freedom, and the future.